ahead and turn this over to Dustin, Kristen, and Morgan and get started. Dustin, you now have control.
Great. Well, thank you, Amy. It's a pleasure to be part of today's webinar. The topic today is key performance indicators and benchmarking. So I looked over the list of attendees just prior and just wanted to get a feel for who's attending today. And I see we've got a very diverse group from all types of industries and business sizes and roles in your organization. So with that in mind, our presentation today is going to be fairly general in nature, but I hope everybody attending can take away some ideas that you can take back to your organizations and you can apply these to your specific needs and circumstances. So I'm going to introduce today's presenters, starting with myself and share a few fun facts about each of us. So my name is Dustin Wheeler, and I am in the Lehi, Utah office of Eide Bailly. And I work with our partner staff and clients across the country with a focus on leveraging accounting technology. And my claim to fame is that as a young boy, I once ran through a screen door trying to escape from a water balloon fight. Good thing that was not filmed because I'd probably be viral and famous today. So Morgan Hirst, she is part of our data analytics group, and she's out of our Orem, Utah office. She works alongside data warehousers to automate and analyze financial and operational reports. So Morgan is a parent to two one-year-old girls who are twins, and her favorite hobby currently is eating the dog's food and playing in the toilet bowl. She is working on becoming an avid skier since she lives in Utah, but is currently hanging out with the 8-year-olds on the bunny hill. So Kristen Tafe, she is in our valuation group. She's based out of Fargo, North Dakota. And she's been with the firm for 12 years now. She performs valuation services and works with the business owners and decision makers on strategic consulting and transaction projects. Kristen listens to an insane number of true crime podcasts and is impatiently waiting for the day that she gets to use that knowledge to solve crime. Kristen's favorite part of the pandemic thus far is Disney Plus adding Hamilton to the list of available shows. So with that, we'll get started here with, I want to start with the very, very basics of this here. And I want to clearly define this acronym we're going to be repeating over and over throughout this webinar. KPI, that is short for Key Performance Indicator. And we'll define that as a measurable value that demonstrates how effectively a company is achieving key business objectives. So to be clear, a KPI is some kind of number. It's not a subjective statement like our customers love us, okay, which is great and all, but a KPI is a number like 90% of our customers gave us 5-star reviews. And the purpose of a KPI is to evaluate the performance of an organization as a whole or a particular activity within the organization, such as a project, a product line, a location, or some initiative, and see whether there's success or maybe there's room for improvement. So first of all, here we'll start off with some financial metrics, and I could go through financial metrics all day, but we're not going to go through every single one. We're just going to go through a couple, a few examples of a few different types. So current ratio. With these financial metrics, they can all be found in your accounting system. They're generally pretty easy to get these numbers. But this current ratio, this is calculated by taking current assets and dividing it by current liabilities. The word current here typically refers to short term, such as cash or cash equivalents expected to be converted to cash within a year. When we say current liabilities, we're expecting those bills that are expected to be paid within a year. So this ratio is one of a few different types of what we call liquidity ratios. The word liquidity referring to the speed and ease at which an asset may be converted to cash. And this provides an indication to a company's ability to pay their bills. So this ratio is frequently used by lenders to evaluate the risk of lending money to an organization. So with the two examples shown here, we see one with a current ratio of 1.16 and the other with a current ratio of 2.22. There we go. So if you're a lender evaluating these two companies, which would you rather lend to? Of course, there are many other factors to consider besides this, but based on this information alone, company number 2 is obviously more financially healthy and has a greater ability to pay back their loans. Their assets are much greater than their liabilities. So next, let's talk about total asset turnover. And this is a type of activity ratio. And now activity ratios help us evaluate the ability of a company to turn its balance sheet accounts into revenue and show how efficiently a company is using its assets. Now, this particular ratio is calculated by dividing sales by the total assets of a company. So this ratio might be used by investors to help consider whether or not they would invest in a company and whether they're likely to get a good return on their investment. So I'll show a quick example here of a couple of companies here. With company number 1, there's a total asset turnover of 1.71. So it's really turning assets into revenue very quickly. And company number 2, we have a ratio of 0.77. We actually have less revenue than assets. Now, of course, there's more information you have to consider in an investment decision. You might want to look at what expenses are in each company and how profitable they are. But based on this information alone, company number 1 seems to be the better investment of the 2. So moving on to some more financial metrics. Now, there are some KPIs that aren't just a financial number. We actually convert these to a number of days. So one example of this is days sales outstanding. And this one takes the accounts receivable balance divided by the sales for a given period and multiplies that by 30. And the purpose of this one is to measure how long, on average, it takes to collect receivables from customers and also understand how many days of revenue you have sitting inside of accounts receivable. So the time frames you apply to this calculation are critical. So you want to carefully consider that and perhaps use an average of accounts receivable balance and average sales for a period for maybe 3 months or more. And you generally only want to use credit sales in this calculation. If you put same day sales in here, it can kind of skew this a little bit. So here's an example right here. We have an accounts receivable balance of 900,000, credit sales of 600,000. Okay, divide those, you get 1.5 times 30 days. Well, that's a result here of 45 days. So on average, you're collecting 45, it takes 45 days to collect your accounts receivable. Okay, next one here, days payable outstanding. You could say this is the opposite of the days sales outstanding. This one takes the accounts payable balance divided by purchases, multiplied by 30 days. So this one gives you an average of how long it takes to pay your vendors. When you calculate this one, you need to know what types of things you have in accounts payable, such as rent or payroll. Those things can skew your calculations. So I'm adding a number of cautions in here, but you really do need to be aware of what goes into these numbers. So in this example, accounts payable balance 500,000 divided by purchases is 700,000. We get 0.7 approximately times 30. That gives us 21 days. It takes us 21 days on average to pay our vendors. So now that we have these numbers, we can compare our days sales outstanding to our days payable outstanding, and we see how fast we are collecting versus how fast we are paying. So in these examples, we're not collecting receivables quickly, but we are paying bills quickly. So if we find ourselves in a cash crunch, that could be a pretty good reason why. And we might want to think of ways we can improve the speed of our collections, and maybe take a look at our payables as well, right? It's a good thing to pay bills on time generally, but not necessarily early. Maybe we can take that 21 to 30, we can get that 45 down to 30, we're in a much better cash position. Speaking of cash position, one more KPI that has especially become relevant in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic is days cash on hand. So this one takes your cash on hand and divides it by the operating expenses. Now the operating expenses excludes non-cash expenses such as depreciation, amortization. And we take that and divide it by 365 days. So what we're calculating with this ratio is how many days an organization can survive without revenue and continue to pay its operating expenses. So this became a kind of a hot topic during 2020 as businesses were shut down for a period of time. Okay, let's see, next slide. Sales metrics. Just want to go over a few of these. with everyone. One mistake I see small businesses commonly make is that the primary report they run to evaluate customers and monitor collections is the accounts receivable aging report. It's an easy report to produce and evaluate, but I think it certainly has its place, but I think that report by itself doesn't tell the whole story. Now, in the previous slide, I mentioned days sales outstanding, and that's also not a perfect indicator. But it shouldn't be considered alone, but it's just one piece along with many other metrics. So there are other sales and customer metrics you can monitor. Right here, we see the number of new customers, repeat sales, customer retention, collection effectiveness. And when you look at reports such as the one you see at the bottom, at the customer level, you can see which ones might require more collection efforts and which ones might require a little more attention for a repeat sale. Now, it takes a combination of several different metrics to see the full picture, and there's software out there that can take all of this information out of your accounting system and generate these reports. These particular screenshots that you see here on the screen, it's from a software partner of ours called Tally Street, which looks at your customer and sales metrics out of your accounting software. Next, marketing metrics. So your marketing people are probably very interested in these. So these are completely non-financial, but I think are very important to track. So a few examples, there are numbers that our marketers like to keep track of: website visits, Facebook likes, Twitter followers, return on marketing investment. So while these might not have a direct financial impact, these metrics can provide some insight into other aspects of a company's performance, such as its reach to customers and how they're getting the most engagement from their customers. Now, the really exciting things with KPIs happen when you mix a financial number with a non-financial number. And some of the things we are able to do with these is come up with KPIs that are financial standards for success for specific industries, and we're able to compare financial results between companies of different sizes. So for example, right here, the sales per square foot. That's a common measurement in retail stores. So if your number here is below the average, maybe you're not located in an ideal location. Maybe you don't have an effective store layout. Revenue per employee. This is often used in professional services as well as technology and software industries, and this might be an indicator on how productive the employees of a company are. Revenue per available room, very common in hospitality. For example, a hotel manager might look at this and see how well a hotel is filling its rooms and how wisely the hotel rooms are being priced to achieve full capacity. You'll hear more on that later. Revenue per active patient, that's often used to compare one medical practice or dental practice to another. Cost per action, okay, another acronym for CPA. That looks at the expenses of a company, and it looks at if you're spending, what you're spending to drive conversions for things like white paper downloads and subscriptions. And so it's tracking how effectively marketing dollars are being spent to make those things happen.
I agree, Dustin. Some of the best metrics to understand success mix that financial with non-financial data. But the trick really is identifying what's a quality production metric for your industry. For example, in accounting, the main production metric for us at least is charge hours, which is dreaded timesheets, obviously. So charge hours and revenue can help us to understand employee utilization. Restaurants have a similar metric called a per person average, which considers the total server sales divided by the number of guests served, and then you identify your per person average for a shift. In hospitality, consideration is given to the average daily rate or the average price paid per room, total revenue divided by the total occupied rooms. Overall, combining those financial and non-financial metrics can help you understand how your revenue driving activity influences your overall performance. So in terms of actual benchmarking, we reference at Eide Bailly many different resources to understand industry metrics. For solely financial data, we utilize RMA, Integra, and ProfitSense. These are subscription services that allow you to drill down by both industry classification code and then further by revenue or asset size. They're updated regularly so you get relevant data. One important key when you're using any sort of database like this is to understand where the information is coming from. For example, some databases will obtain their information from tax returns. which I think we all know typically have a different purpose or strategy than your normal internal or audited financial statements. Make sure you're considering this when you're comparing to industry metrics, if that's the case. For the data that mixes financial and non-financial data, we often look to specific industry publications. Additionally, in some industries, you can join an industry group. Those groups typically host events and also share financial data in a redacted or on a combined form, in a combined way, so you don't necessarily know whose information is whose. If industry resources aren't available to you, it's still important to measure these metrics internally and track your progress. Use these metrics as a point of comparison in monthly or an annual analysis. Once you've identified the data, you know where to get comparable information from. You can communicate it to the right people to create buy-in. And it's really identifying what matters to that specific person. For example, if you want employees to understand the significance of certain metrics, then those metrics should indicate these are the ones that are going to allow for growth and your advancement in our company. For shareholders, it would be these are the metrics that are going to result in more profitability, which means higher distributions to you. So really focus on linking the metrics to what is important to those stakeholders.
That's right. Thank you, Kristen. Now, at this point, now that we've learned about KPIs and seen some examples, you might be wondering, well, what KPIs should I measure in my business? And the truth is, you might not be ready for that question yet. Now, the place to start is, well, if you don't know what your business objectives are, you need to get that figured out first. And think about what key business questions you're trying to answer, what kind of outcomes you're trying to achieve. Now, the KPIs you ultimately decide to measure are driven by your strategy. So second, think about how you're going to measure what you're going to achieve. You might need to put software in place that will gather data. You might need to send out a survey. You might need to replace or upgrade your existing systems for tracking that data. So next, you need to avoid information overload and narrow down the list of KPIs you're going to track to a fairly short list. So some of the organizations I work with, they keep that down to a rule of 7. So they try to keep the list of KPIs down to 7 or less. That way you don't have this big cluttered report with a bunch of data you may not use. So now you may have heard this quote right here on the screen, and this is from Robert McNamara. He said, measure what is important. Don't make important what you can measure. And I use this quote because there seems to be a tendency for organizations to track those numbers that are easy to gather and easy to explain. So trying to make it easy, but they may not be the most meaningful or impactful to the organization. So I think it's worth the effort to determine the best KPIs to track and go with those, even if it takes a little more work up front to measure those and analyze those. Put that effort into finding the best KPIs. Now, tracking KPIs isn't going to do a lot of good unless you create a data-driven culture in your organization. And right here, I have a link to an article. I'm also going to paste this into the chat. So, so that link here is in the chat that you can click on. One of my favorite publications, the Harvard Business Review. And this article right here explains why it's so hard to create a data-driven company. And technology is not the biggest barrier, contrary to maybe popular belief. The biggest challenge is culture and finding ways to incorporate data into the decision-making process. So to overcome this requires communication and improving people's skill sets, embracing change. Those things are hard for people, but one way I've noticed companies doing this is they incorporate data into team meetings and they regularly revisit it. So I feel like if everybody knows that management is looking at these numbers, then everybody else, managers and staff, all of your employees, start to keep those numbers in mind. You don't want to have an obsession of numbers. I think that could be detrimental, but I think if everybody has those numbers in mind when they're making decisions, you tend to have better results. So now identifying the technology you're going to use, our last bullet point here, identifying the technology should be the last step that in this process. because technology by itself doesn't create value from this data. And Morgan will touch on the technology used a little bit later here in our webinar. So with that, I will turn this over to Kristen.
Thanks, Dustin. As Dustin stated earlier, my background is in valuation. So today I am going to discuss the overlap between the value of a business and key performance indicators. And I am probably going to use the word value way too much in the next few slides, so just forgive me for that right away. Also, just to specify, my interest in true crime is purely like in the Sherlock role, not the Ted Bundy role. So I feel like that's an important enough thing to just make sure that it's stated. There's a strong overlap between valuation and KPIs. There are 3 stages of valuation where they come into play. The first one is measuring value, the initial valuation to understand what operations are worth. Building value using certain metrics and data derived from the valuation to identify ways to increase or improve the value of a company. And then realizing value upon exit or a set period in the future. Consider KPIs to update the valuation. Consider the KPIs in updating the valuation and to compare where the growth stemmed from in the business operations. First, let's go over a little bit of valuation theory. There are 3 approaches that you look at to value a business. The first one is the income approach. The income approach focuses on 3 different things: the cash flows, the risk rate, and then those 2 collectively help you identify the actual value of operations. So the cash flows, they can be based on either historical or projected. The idea is to really understand what is the future going to look like. For a lot of companies, that is looking at historical operations. However, if you're a startup, that really doesn't have any impact on you. Or if you're significantly changing operations, then historical may not be your best bet. The risk rate is where we look at the economic, the industry risks, the financial performance and trends, diversification of products, of people, among other things, including who's doing the work here. Do we have any reliance on that person? If they were to get hit by a bus, what happens to operations? So there's a lot of things that go into identifying a risk rate. And then, like I said, those 2 combined help us to get to the value of operations. Under a market approach, we identify a comparable population of transactions and use that to identify a range of multiples. A comparable population takes a little bit of effort. I shouldn't say a little bit, it takes effort to build out. We can look at public company data, taking into consideration that yes, it may not be sized the exact same, but let's still just see what the multiples are doing on the market. We can look at private company transactions. We have access to multiple databases where we can drill into what is comparable to your company. The crucial thing here is looking at the industry, the business purpose, the size, among other factors. And really, we use that information to say what's the appropriate multiple to apply to your company's either revenue, profitability, any of those types of things. And then the last approach is the asset approach, and that actually focuses on the underlying assets that drive value in a business operation. So typically, the balance sheet is at least a good starting point, but the goal is to restate that to fair market value. It takes away any indications of, or any tax strategies by restating to fair market value, or if you use cash versus accrual accounting, it gives credit for those things that might not appear on your balance sheet. So where do we actually consider KPIs in the valuation? The first place is in performing a financial analysis of your business operations. A key part of evaluation is this financial analysis. We need to understand how you compare to the industry and identify trends in your own operations. This helps us to understand if you're a high or a low performer and the impact of certain economic and industry changes on your operations. The next place that we consider KPIs in the development of the specific company risk under the income approach. A higher risk rate means a lower value. So there's an inverse relationship there. So we take information from discussions with owners or stakeholders and then our financial analysis, along with additional research to determine the appropriate rate of risk to apply to your business operations. And then the last place where those KPIs really come into play are in identification of the appropriate market multiple to apply in the market approach. So we use KPIs to really identify where you fit in with that comparable population of transactions. The next step that I talked about, measuring value and then building value. The KPIs can help to create a strategic plan to build value in your operations. Not only do they help to identify the goal, but also to monitor your progress or if you've been successful. At a high level, increasing the value of your operations means reducing risk and improving cash flows. So to improve cash flows, the overall focus is on growing revenue, improving margins, and effectively managing your assets. However, you need a plan to do those things. Like, you can't just say grow revenue and then hope that it works out. So those KPIs can really help you create a plan within those different topics to grow your value. So now we're going to go over a few examples. Everybody loves an example, just to see how KPIs come into play. So this first one is a company that was valued at one point, and then again a few years later after setting certain goals based on KPIs. So the original valuation indicated a value of $5 million. The owner had an exit timeline in mind and wanted to really be preparing for that exit. Let me start increasing value so that way upon exit, I can get the most out of this business as possible. So we utilize KPIs to set goals to build value. The first goal was continue to grow revenues. One important note was that we wanted to grow revenues, but not just rely on our key customers to do so. We wanted to diversify that customer base with this growth. Next, we wanted to improve the gross profit margin, get in line with the industry standards for this company, but at the same time, maintain overhead. Another KPI that we focused on was improving the inventory turn. Let's put more strategy into buying inventory to get in line with industry metrics. And then lastly, we asked the owner to focus on reducing key person dependence and really train the management team that's going to stay post-transaction, so that way they can continue operations as they've always been going. So you can see we have an original column that was from the original valuation, and then we have the goal and then actual results. So this client was able to successfully increase revenue. This was driven a large part in the revenue growth. They increased revenue, reduced the reliance on the key customer to do so. They didn't quite hit their gross margin goal yet, but we kind of offset that with the revenue growth, and the inventory days dropped, reflecting the focus that they made on better inventory planning. So overall, they improved value by focusing on a few items and creating an actionable plan. So the next example that we have is looking at the impact of different KPIs if you were to do a strategic investment. So as you can see here, we have column A and B, and then there are forecasts for the same company. So the same operating results in year one, and then year two shows in column B what would happen if we were to really invest in operations. We're going to take on a large amount of debt, but what's the payoff going to be? So the results of this, column A, strong debt to equity ratio, stable margins below the industry, but they've been able to hold on to their margins, and solid revenue. There's been growth there, so that's a good thing. However, in column B, you can see that they took on that larger debt load, so that's more risk. They have a higher debt to equity ratio, and they are above the industry in every year of the analysis. However, what's really significant here is the revenue and Ebitda numbers that are shown because they were able to take on that. They were able to take on that debt. They were able to reach more customers, and they were able to push more dollars to the bottom line because of certain efficiencies. So while certain metrics might not appear that great, for example, their debt to equity ratio isn't as great in column B as compared to column A, the value changes significantly and it grows significantly because of the growth in revenue and the growth in the Ebitda margin. What this tells us is that not every metric that isn't looking great as compared to industry represents a bad metric. Sometimes there are those ones that are part of a bigger strategic plan, and that needs to be considered as well. Beating the industry, if that's your only focus, that could restrict your growth. So consider the strategy and using your KPIs as a way to get there. Even if there are some poor looking metrics for a short period of time, like in this situation, the debt to equity ratio in column B for year two. However, a few years down the road, the impact is huge in terms of what that means for the overall value. You can't build value just by cutting costs. All right, and now we have our third example. So this is focusing on hotels. And each hotel in this situation, or each one represents a different strategy, I should say. So in column A, the focus is on, let's consider multiple KPIs. Column B, the strategy is to focus on occupancy, and column C, the focus is on the highest average charged rate. For column B, to get the highest occupancy, they have to charge lower rates. The average room rate results in being $126. Additionally, because occupancy is so high, their variable costs, when based on a percentage of revenue, including front office staff, housekeeping, maintenance, those variable costs increase as a percentage of revenue. That impacts the overall profitability. Overall, profit margins decrease because there's just more costs to achieve this level of income. In column C, the focus is on the highest average charged rate. Because they're focusing on that rate, their occupancy suffers. The average room rate is $133 per night. They have strong revenue and they're able to maintain their variable costs. However, it does make you wonder, what would be the impact if you just drop those rates a little bit to improve occupancy from 70% up? And obviously that's a non-COVID year, 70% being the poorest metric used in this example. That brings us to column A. And in column A, the focus is on finding the best mix between the average charge rate and occupancy. And you can see success here noted in the average room rate at $140. And that formula is total room revenue divided by total occupied rooms. This considers both occupancy and the average charge price. This allows you to maximize revenue and profitability. So overall, I just really wanted to highlight here the importance of KPIs on developing your strategy and considering multiple KPIs for success. We don't want you to get bogged down in too many, but also don't just focus on one because it could mean you're leaving important metrics on the table. All right, let's turn it over to Morgan.
And maybe just to pause here for a moment because I don't see questions right now in the Q&A. If you have questions, please type those in at the bottom. There's that button for Q&A. We should have about 5 or 10 minutes at the end of our webinar to address any questions that people have. If we have extra time, then without questions, then I don't know, maybe Kristen will tell some dad jokes. So, but
I can tell dad jokes all day. I actually asked my spouse yesterday if he had any good jokes, and then I specifically said I would not use them because I would assume they are even worse than mine. So
there you go. Well, take it away, Morgan.
Yeah, for sure. Just like Kristen was saying, key performance indicators are going to vary a lot company to company. And I like to view KPIs as kind of a business wellness check. And a physical wellness check that a doctor does would look a lot different for an elderly man than an Olympic female athlete. And similarly, every company is so different that your KPIs and your analysis and objectives will and should look different. But just to keep going along this example of a business wellness check, when you go to a doctor's office, they'll check you, kind of just standard things, right? Your blood pressure, heart rate, your temperature, your weight and height. If a doctor just took your temperature and told you that you were healthy and kind of sent you on your way, it wouldn't really make sense, right? Because temperature isn't a good gauge of overall health. So similarly, to the right, you can see a business wellness check. There's several different things you can check, and not one KPI will ever be a good gauge of overall business health. So just like Dustin and Kristen had mentioned, it's really important to look at a variety of different KPIs that will tell you different things. I really like Dustin's number of 7, right? Because you don't want too many KPIs that they no longer hold anyone accountable, but you need enough to give you that full picture. So KPIs also don't have much significance, the current KPI, unless there's compared to something. As a standalone number, not that helpful. With comparisons, they bring so much meaning to your business. So just a few different benchmarks is the industry standard. And Kristen mentioned some really great firm tools that can give you some direction there if you're kind of not sure what the industry standard is for your company. There's also a great one is a goal. So what does this number have to be? What does this KPI have to be in order to meet business objectives? And then there's like historical. So that's probably the most relevant and easiest to get. It's comparing current KPIs to last month, quarter, last year's numbers. And always have at least 2 benchmarks for the same reasons as we talked about before. It gives you a full picture. For example, you could look at your KPI and compare it to an industry standard and say, okay, I'm way below industry standard. But if you look at that same KPI compared to that KPI a year ago, so your historical, You can be like, wow, but we improved way more than we were last year and we're heading in the right direction. So again, you're always trying to get that full picture out of your financials. Now, benchmarks also make it really easy to divide your KPIs into buckets. And I like dividing KPIs into like a green, yellow, and red bucket. So the green is KPIs that are meeting or exceeding expectations. And there's very little that you need to do on these. You might ask yourself, who's driving these numbers that we can reward? Or how is this benefiting my business and how can we maintain this? Then there is the yellow bucket. So it's KPIs that are below expectations but non-urgent. The KPI not performing how you want it to isn't going to affect short-term operations. And sometimes there's a reason for it. So I love the example Kristen used earlier. Maybe your company is more leveraged than you want it to be, and you have a long-term goal to acquire more cash and pay down your debts. But you kind of want that low right now because you're wanting to grow really fast. And so you kind of have that trade-off. But it's good to be aware of what that trade-off is. And so again, I would keep that in a yellow bucket. So it's kind of in the back of your mind and you know it's there. Then there is the red KPIs. Those are below expectations and urgent. The most common in small businesses of red KPIs are usually cash flow related or revenue growth related, but it can be a variety of different things. So let's pretend that your company's red KPI is profit margin. So you've figured out that that's the KPI that's going to start affecting your operations. You really want to give that immediate attention. The next step would be to do some additional testing. So when you find a red KPI, you don't stop there. You've got to diagnose the problem, diagnose why it's lower than what you want it to be. So if the example might be a retail store, profit margin in a retail store, you could slice the data in a few different ways. You could look at gross profit by location. And maybe you find that of your 5 locations, profit margin is only low in one of them, and it's dragging down your overall profit margin. Could also look at gross profit by product. And then you'd be able to see really easily your high profit margin products compared to your low profit margin products, or maybe even discover that you're losing some money on products. You could also look at gross profit by manufacturer and figure out if some prices of manufacturers are really eating into your overall profit margins. Now, this diagnosis and KPIs in general should always move you to do something. So going along this same example, right? We're a retail chain and we are trying to improve our gross profit. We can look at that diagnosis, gross profit by location, and say, okay, how can we solve the one failing location's profit margin problem? Do we consider shutting it down? Do we go into successful retail stores and try to mirror good, successful processes in the failing one? Gross profit by product, maybe you consider changing your marketing strategies so you start selling more of higher margin products, or maybe it's a good opportunity to adjust prices to increase margins on products you may be losing money on. And then gross profit by manufacturer might be a good opportunity to renegotiate some of your prices with your manufacturers to really help drive down those costs and give you the margins that you're looking for. I feel like a KPI should always move you to do something and move your business forward. Too many board meetings are all about the numbers and then everyone leaves feeling defeated. But really KPIs, whether good or bad, should really give you an excitement about the changes your business can make to get it in the direction that you want to be going. So at this point, the concern is data visibility. And that's kind of where data analytics comes in and why it's such an essential part in everyone's business. Data analytics is the answer to so many of the problems you may have. It's the transformation, organization, and modeling of data to help businesses make better decisions. I like to kind of break this down into a few different parts. The first part being that data analytics gives you complete data and a complete view. So it's all data living in a single place. Time tracking data, financial data, sales data, marketing data, all in one place. All of your store locations, all living in one place. I feel like too often in my career, I will see that there's a problem with the number right away, but then it takes half of my day to diagnose what's wrong, right? Did the bookkeeper make an incorrect journal entry? Did we not onboard those clients? Is a manufacturer late for a shipment? Did we, what is wrong? And it just takes so much time to figure that out. But when all data lives in a single place, it becomes way easier to do that. It's also complete in the sense that it's accurate. It gives your company one source of truth. So your KPI is being pulled the same way today as it was the last time you looked at it. And it also makes it so that marketing isn't looking at different numbers than the management team. It also safeguards your data, it protects it, and it protects its integrity. And so you have these trained data warehousers that are going to make sure that the data you're looking at is accurate. Data analytics also gives you data in a timely way. It's timely in two ways, right? It's available. So it gives you all your reports in one place. It also gives you the control over who can see them. So as a CEO, you might want to see a high level of everything from marketing to finances to operations. But as a salesman, you probably only want your salesman to see his quota and what he's actually doing. And so data analytics gives you the power to kind of distribute who sees what. It also gives you the ability to track report use. So rather than having to pull everyone in on Friday and show them all the reports, people can be looking at them on their own, and you can be holding them accountable by checking the usage. It's also timely in the sense that there's automatic refreshes. From daily to real time, your reports are updated, so you can know you're always looking at the most recent data. And it also saves you the time of recreating reports. So if you want to see something, you don't have to be like, well, I don't want to bug Mary for this marketing report because it's going to take her half the day to make it. I'll just go without. Instead, you're always able to look at those reports and glean value from it. Going back to that example of taking half of a day to diagnose a problem, data analytics is powerful because all the data is in one place and the reports are so streamlined. It allows you to look at KPIs in a million different ways to easily diagnose problems. So you can look at a KPI like profit margin as high level as you want, but then you can drill down in a click of a button and you can see it by location, by product, by manager, as detailed as you want. You can also see what's making up your KPI. So cost of goods sold. Well, what expense categories are making up my cost of goods sold? And I want to see that by account, then I want to see that by vendor, then I want to see that by transaction, then I want to see the memo on the transaction. So you see that power of seeing as little or as much as you want. I think in today's society, the problem isn't the lack of information, it's that we can often become flooded with information. And data analytics organizes the data so that you never have to feel that way, like you don't have enough information or that you have too much. It's there and organized and ready to be taken advantage of. The last thing I want to touch on is that data analytics is beautiful. Excel docs are intimidating and hard to digest. And I'm an accountant, I have an accountant background. So saying that out loud makes me sad because I love Excel docs, but the reality is there's better ways to do your reporting. And data analytics makes it possible to have beautiful reports that are accessible to everybody. And it really, the way you present reports really allows you and other people to know the overall health of your company at even a glance, which is super relevant. Now, the question you might be asking yourself is, where are you in your data needs? And where are you right now in your data awareness? So this will be sent out after, and I'll let you guys take a better look at this later, but this kind of shows a scale of data awareness. And maybe you're right now level 1, you're unaware, and you're referring to spreadsheets and you're requesting one-off reports. But here at Eide Bailly, we believe every company is a data company, and we want every business to be able to use data to transform their company. And we want everyone to be closer to a level 4 and a level 5 in really utilizing your data. Now, it's almost inevitable that you'll need the kind of data analytics that really automates and streamlines your numbers eventually, if you don't already see the need for that and are having some pain points. This often requires an on-site or outsourced business intelligence service, which I think Eide Bailly does best, but there's lots of different options that can fit your company's needs. That's where cost savings is so important. Because of the nature of data analytics, 65% of any of your costs are refundable via an R&D tax credit. And that really makes data analytics an amazing option to solve your business problems, but also makes that cost effective. And it really just, again, data analytics really drives your KPIs and sets your business up for positive change. I love the other stuff Dustin and Kristen touched on that also focused on knowing your business objectives and knowing the KPIs that you want to be tracking and starting there. But yeah, that is just kind of what I wanted to touch on. And Dustin, Christian, should we just open up the floor for questions, or is there anything else you guys would like to talk on?
Yeah, we do have one question here in the Q&A, and this is from, let's see, Renee Boyle, and asking, what are some resources for determining industry standard or data for benchmarking? Which I think you touched on, Kristen. Do you want to elaborate on some of those resources?
Yeah, I do. So we utilize 3 different resources, although there's more out there. These are just the ones that I've personally been a part of. The first one is called RMA, or the Risk Management Association. RMA is, I'm just looking right now, but they take information directly from financial statements of small and medium-sized businesses, business clients of their member institutions. So it's a bigger organization that gathers the information, then puts it out. They sort it by industry classification code. And then from there, you can drill into the size of revenue, size of assets, and they really specify like this information was taken from audited financials, reviewed financials, that type of thing. So it gives you a lot of data to understand what I am actually comparing here. Another one that we've used in the past is called Integra, or Integra Microbuilt. That one's very similar. You get the original sort is by industry, and then from there, I believe it's by revenue size. I believe Integra focuses on information from tax returns. So like I said before, that would just be a caution unless you're planning on applying that same comparison, but you just want to make sure you're using an apples to apples comparison, or you're at least taking that into consideration. So if you're looking at Integra data that's pulled from tax returns, it might show, 3% profitability for a certain industry, whereas the same industry under RMA might show something above that, because the idea of taxable income versus financial statement income often varies. And then the last one is pulling from Profit Sense. And Profit Sense is a tool that has a lot of other purposes, but one of the things that they can do is benchmark you against other users that utilize Profit Sense and their financial data. So all 3 of them kind of have a different reach, I would say.
Yeah, and I could throw one more out there. We also use IBIS World for the industry reports there. I think they're a little more high level maybe than some of the ones you mentioned, but still have some really good explanations of what's happening in different industries. And at a high level, we'll give you, salaries as a percentage of revenue, or marketing expenses as a percentage of revenue. So you'll get some of those there, some of those financial KPIs and data for benchmarking. So any other questions? Maybe have another couple minutes if you want to type something in. We are close to 50 minutes now after the hour, but okay, we do have one that just came through. Edson Barton, he is asking here, you mentioned EB provides data analytics services. Can you explain those services briefly? Also, can you share other data analytics services for small and medium-sized companies? So that may be a good question for you, Morgan.
Yeah, Eide Bailly, our analytics team actually does focus more on the mid-sized companies. And what we do is the first thing we'll do is the discovery of your business, and so we'll get a better idea of the kind of KPIs you're wanting to track and the reports you're wanting to use, and the time that we can save you with that. And so I can reach out to you after this call if you'd like me to, but that's usually kind of where we start, is to figure out your business needs. And then we usually give you an estimate of the time it would take. And then the first step is getting engineers to organize your data, right? To get it all in one place, to make sure it has integrity. And then from there, we build the reports out that you want to give you the visibility that you need. And then we usually pair you with a financial analyst that can give you assistance in kind of handing off those reports and gleaning as much value from them as you can. So I hope that answered your question.
It did, and I think it explains, while we're here on the slide, it explains where your specialty is in KPIs and consulting and data analytics. So that was a great question there for you to answer. And while we're on the slide too, I'll just go over myself here. So my focus is more on monthly accounting. So outsourcing your accounting to us, business processes like your accounts payable. We do that. We do those services for clients on a monthly basis. Kind of an outsourced accounting department, And we include with that consulting and tracking your KPIs and putting together simple dashboards. So that's what we do in business outsourcing and strategy. And then Kristen, who you heard from as well, more of a focus on valuation, but also very KPIs are a big part of her job. Yep, we do have another question. Looks like Morgan's typing an answer to this one from Joshua Christensen.
Yeah, I can type it or I can just speak to it, whatever works.
Let's hear it, Morgan.
Hey, so for small businesses, that's a great question. And that's where you are probably experiencing a little bit less pain points to your data awareness than a bigger company would. The bigger you get, the more data analytics plays a part in your business. But a great way to start as a smaller business is through a data lake or a data gateway. It's a less expensive and less timely way to get all your data in one place and to streamline reports off of them, and more for a smaller scale that can then grow into something bigger as you grow. And there's also a lot of ways to just save time in reporting. Sometimes that's a good kind of way to start data analytics. It's just to say, how can we automate any of these reports, and maybe even a smaller scale, and how can we save back office people time, and how can we make sure the reports are accurate? But yeah, I would definitely say data lake is the short answer for that, the quicker way of getting analytics in a small scale.
And Morgan, could you take the next question too? What application do you use for dashboard creation?
Yeah, what application? I like Power BI. I feel like that's a really powerful tool. The desktop version is free, and then licenses are actually very not very costly. It's like $10 per user, I think, so not expensive. And it's pretty, I don't want to say it's intuitive, but it's very Googleable. So most people, if they really are willing to take the time, and if they're willing to Google to like have questions answered, can really use that tool. And other people in my department would argue that Tableau is also a great reporting source, and maybe even superior to Power BI. So those are our two favorites, but there's so many of them.
Yeah, and I feel like this question could have many different answers. It all depends on what you want to do with the dashboard. You know, you can get a financial dashboard out of ERPs like NetSuite and Intact. Those have dashboard creation tools within them. If you're using a software like QuickBooks Online or Xero, those have applications that connect with them. Giraffe is one, spelled J-I-R-A-V. Fathom is another one that we use. So many different types of dashboards to consider if you're maybe a do-it-yourselfer. But yeah, in our analytics department, if you want some really flexible and customizable dashboards, something really powerful, our data analytics team really leverages Power BI and Tableau there.
All right, and I can take the next question. For valuation of a sale or a purchase, is the best metric Ebitda? Is there a general range used for deals? How about here, about 5 to 7 for traditional businesses? Are other metrics used? And then some questions about multipliers. So the first part of this question is the best metric Ebitda? And I would say that Ebitda is one of the best metrics. So Ebitda allows you to look at profitability, but takes out of consideration the impact of tax strategies by removing depreciation, intangible assets by removing amortization, and any debt preferences by removing interest expense. So that is a great thing to consider. Something that you also might want to consider is seller's discretionary earnings, which is Ebitda, but then you also add back owner's compensation, which is to say that, hey, the owner actually took this out too, because that's a very discretionary item depending on how involved or non-involved the ownership group is. You might not get as much data available for comparability if you look at seller's discretionary earnings, but it is something to consider. We would also say that revenue has a ton of value. Revenue multiples are often just a great way to look at operations. Are you always going to transact at them? Not necessarily, but they are something that should be considered because every potential buyer has a different strategy. So if I'm going to buy your company and I'm just coming in off the straight, it has to provide me with a salary, it has to support my family. Ebitda is going to be super, super important to me. However, if one of your competitors is going to buy you or somebody that's within your industry, then that revenue or the ability to touch more customers that you already have in your company, that might be what they focus on. So there's a few different metrics that you should consider, but all of those, it just depends on who's the potential interested party and how you should consider them. I think that you should give some consideration to all of them. Businesses that have very low or no EBITDA, so they just aren't cash flowing, it doesn't mean there's no value there. So that's just something to keep in mind. And the next part of this question is, does an EBITDA multiplier of 5 equate to a return of 14%? That's a little bit different. You want to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples. So an EBITDA multiplier of 5, that is a perfectly normal range. Oftentimes we'll hear people, depending on the industry, say, 5 to 7 times EBITDA. I would say that can at times be a little bit high, but it's just a generalization. We look at those on the rule of thumb on a more by industry thing. That doesn't necessarily mean a risk rate of 14%, just because the risk rate is typically applied to available cash flows, which can be different than EBITDA. You have to consider some of those other things like working capital needs or CapEx investment, those types of things. All right, and when comparing your KPIs to industry KPIs, does size matter? It does. So if there isn't a ton of information available, then definitely look at the industry data as a whole. If you're able to drill further in, I think that can be really helpful, because maybe overhead is a certain percentage and you can't escape that. And if your revenues aren't as great as a company that's 15 times your size, then what can you really do to improve your profit margin if you cannot impact that overhead? So there is something to be said about that. However, some industry standard is better than nothing. So even if you aren't able to drill into by revenue size, if you look at it as an overarching industry, it can at least provide you with something there. All right. Any other questions that you guys see?
All right, that's all I see in there. So it looks like we are able to give everyone about 2 minutes back in their day. Okay, well, thank you all so much for attending. Thank you to our presenters, and we hope everyone has a fantastic day.